What is a global neuronal workspace theory, GNWT, and how does GNWT explain failure of conscious report due to inattention? So the global neuronal workspace theory is a highly influential model of consciousness at the moment. And the key figure for this theory is this Bernard Bars and Stanislas Dehaene. And their definition of the global workspace is that it's a space that can hold some information in the working memory, and then they can also use guide the behaviors. And to explain various phenomenology related to inattention, they also consider backward masking as well, but the signal strengths and also attention amplification determines what enters into global workspace. So GNWT's key idea is something like this. So remember the Lame's classification of attention and consciousness. They consider first there is a input coming into the global workspace that are competing each other. Okay, and then once it enters within this global workspace, then that becomes consciously available. And then once something is available in the consciousness, that can be used for many different kind of motor behavior or report and so on. But the things that does this reporting itself and so on itself are all unconscious. So this sensory input side and also motor output side itself, they are unconscious. And that's proposed by this Bars cognitive theory. Following this idea and then make it more sort of the brain compatible, Stan Dehaene proposed the following. So global workspace is something that is organized at the central kind of model here and related to executive function of the brain, mainly done in parietal cortex, frontal cortex, and anterior cingulate and so on. And these areas receives the input from perceptual signal in systems, including a vision, audition, touch, and so on. And then, as the Bars also suggests here, motor systems also receives the output from global workspace. But there is some kind of shortcut here as well, and that is responsible for the sort of the reflex. But it's separately controlled by this unconscious system for both perception and motor. And then global workspace content is controlled by the attentional systems and also evaluative systems and also long-term memory. And they kind of bias or control what enters into global workspace. And unlike global workspace theory per se originally, Dehaene proposed what kind of neural connections and also areas should be the underlying mechanism for this. So here, the sensory areas are considered as a sort of neuronal processing within the sensory areas, and then prefrontal areas and so on can maintain this global workspace. And then they started to analyze the connectivity and constructing computational models and so on. And then that resulted in some kind of computational model that resulted in recent experiments and also various findings according to global workspace theory. So for example, here is the recording or model that would presumably explain what's going to happen in the case of the monkey brain when weak stimulus is presented to the visual systems, but not paid attention. Okay. So I receive the input, and then that's sent to LGN and then V1. And then V1 processes this weak stimulus, maybe backward mask, and then it propagates to B2, B4, and then FEA, and so on. But because it's too weak or not paid attention to, this recurrent connection, self connection or feedback is progressively weaker. And then as a result, frontal area doesn't become active. That's a sort of situation, predicted situation without attention or weak stimulus. On the other hand, if the stimulus is strong enough or paid attention to by picked up by top-down attention, for example, let's say it's something that you are waiting for to come, then the V1 activity itself could be weak, in fact, but it's possible to enhance by the frontal areas or parietal areas, like here, through the feedback connection, expecting or attending to something, and that results in the further increase in the V4 activity, and then that results in this conscious perception of the strongly attended stimulus. Okay. So, how does explain various phenomenology of the consciousness? So this is a schematic published in 2006 that has 2x2 design. X-axis, Y-axis is a bottom-up stimulus strength. So as you go from top to the bottom, a stimulus is either weak or interrupted by the mask, and then the bottom one is sufficiently strong. And the X-axis is the top-down attention. It's either absent or selected, amplified, and so on the right. Then first, when attention doesn't pick up and the stimulus itself is weak or interrupted, that's the case where activation is confined within this, occipital B1 areas and so on. And it's very weak, and then there doesn't produce any kind of, effect throughout. And in terms of the conscious processing, it's a no reportability, and also it doesn't even produce any kind of the behavior, like little or no priming. Okay, and so activation is already weak in the RE extrastriate areas. Next, if the stimulus is very strong, but attention doesn't pick up, and that's a situation where your attention blink or inattentional blindness or change blindness corresponds to. And that's what they call the pre-conscious. It's intensely activating RE visual areas here, but it doesn't go to parietal or frontal areas. And that's because attention doesn't pick up. And then this results in occipitotemporal loops and the local synchrony. So synchrony of activity confined in the bottom left. But priming, remember that the Haynes, paper presented in week 3 or 4, he found that the behavior priming is still there on the invisible stimulus. And that's presumably because of this residual amplified stimulus on this invisible stimuli. But still, because it doesn't get activated for the frontal areas, it does result in no reportability. And in fact, you may not have seen things in the change blindness or inattention blindness. That's the explanation. And then it also makes a prediction or explanation about the attention making picking up some kind of weak stimulus, so weak or interrupted stimulus, but amplified from prefrontal or parietal areas. And here, activation itself can propagate, in a feed-forward manner because of the expectation and attention. But depth of the processing is still quite, weak, and it's very weakly and also short-lived kind of a status. And so it results in eventually no reportability, but attention can select this weak stimulus. That's the key finding compared to key prediction or expression compared to this unattended subliminal stimulus. Okay, because even if stimulus is weak, this model still predicts that maybe the priming and so on can become stronger by paying attention. Then finally, conscious processing is quite distinct from both. It requires sufficiently strong stimulus to be amplified by the attention. So that results in this global level of activation. And then it is amplified throughout the sensory motor activity, and also parietal frontal network becomes very engaged, and then long distance loops and synchrony observed in a global manner, and then long duration activity follow the up as well as conscious reportability for, according to this model. Okay. So in nutshell, global neural workspace theory almost identifies attentional amplification is necessary for conscious access. And then with this, now the question is, can we really explain attention-related blindness phenomena with a biased competition model and or global neural workspace theory? So how does this explain inattentional or change blindness? It's a strong stimuli, but because it's not selected and amplified, it doesn't enter to global neural workspace, which is a prefrontal apparatus areas. And that's why you don't see it. How does it explain attention blink and backward masking? Again, it's a competition, but it's now the competition over the time. So if you select one stimulus in the attentional blink, let's say paying attention to R, then you lose the neurons that respond to the C later, lose its competition. And that's a sort of a competition model, but applied in the temporal domain. And then eventually, the first one that is amplified enters into global workspace. And backward masking is also the same. Over the time, there is some kind of competition, and then one of them gets winning competition because of the selection. So in summary, global neuronal workspace theory can explain various aspects of attention-related reports of the blindness through a failure of amplification of signal and reaching to the global workspace. So it can explain various reports about consciousness. But now the question is whether this report is really reflecting the conscious experience per se. And what is the link between the neuronal activity and the consciousness still remains discussed. And that's something that we are going to talk about in the next week. And the remaining question is, for example, is attention necessary for consciousness when there's no competition? So remember that both biased competition model and also global neural workspace theory talk about the competition. But let's say if you don't have any kind of interesting stimulus at the fovea, and then things in the periphery is just presented alone, then there's no point in invoking competition, right? In that case, even without reporting or even without any task, do we still see this isolated stimulus? And then can we explain also the phenomenology of the dual task using biased competition global neural workspace theory? Why can we see faces and also natural scenes under the dual task, but not the disks? On its own, it's a bit difficult to make sense, right? Both of them are not really selected by attention. And we also control the strength of the stimulus for faces and the disks by changing the transparency and also manipulating it so that both of them can be perceived at 70%. But this Julian's experiment showed that under that situation, you do need to pay attention to face, pay attention to the disks to see it, but faces automatically gets into the consciousness. So why is it? And another question is, can attention operate on both visible and invisible stimuli? And these are the questions that we are going to address in the next week. See you.